Remember when farmhouse grandmas made 60 candies from whatever grew on the farm, and most families today have completely forgotten them? Sorghum taffy, hickory nut brittle, maple cream, none of it cost a penny at the store. These homemade sweets helped rural families survive the Depression without buying candy. Today, they've vanished, even though they taste better than anything you're unwrapping. It wasn't store-bought candy, but it was the sweetest thing on the farm. Sorghum candy was the dark, chewy treat Grandma made every fall after the sorghum press ran all day. She stood at the stove with a heavy pot of farm-pressed sorghum syrup boiling on the burner. The syrup was thick, dark, and smelled earthy like molasses, but deeper. She cooked it to the hard crack stage, testing it by dropping a spoonful into cold water until it snapped. When it was ready, she poured it onto a buttered pan and let it cool until it was hard enough to break into pieces. The candy tasted rich and complex, not just sweet. It had a mineral flavor from the soil and the stalks. A batch cost almost nothing to make in 1955 because the sorghum came straight from the field. By the 1960s, corn syrup replaced sorghum in most kitchens. Sorghum candy vanished. Nobody makes it anymore. It took hours to make because the nuts had to be cracked by hand. Hickory nut candy was the farmhouse brittle made with wild nuts gathered from the woods every October. Grandma sat on the porch with a hammer and a bowl, cracking hickory nuts one by one. The shells were thick and hard. Each nut had to be picked clean with a nut pick to get the meat out. When she had enough nuts, she made a simple brittle, sugar, butter, and water boiled to hard crack stage. The hickory nuts went in at the end, and the whole thing poured onto a buttered pan. The candy came out golden and crunchy with a strong, almost bitter nut flavor. Hickory nuts tasted wilder than pecans or walnuts. A batch cost nothing but time in 1954. By the 1960s, pecans became easier to buy, and hickory nuts were too much work. Hickory nut candy disappeared. Nobody makes it anymore. It tasted tangy and sweet at the same time. Buttermilk fudge was the farmhouse candy made with leftover buttermilk from churning butter. Grandma stood at the stove with a heavy pot and poured in 2 cups of real cultured buttermilk. The thick, a sour kind that sat on the counter after the butter was done. She added sugar and a little butter and cooked it slowly, stirring constantly until it reached soft ball stage. The fudge smelled sweet and sour while it cooked. When it was ready, she poured it into a buttered pan and let it cool. The fudge came out pale and creamy, with a tangy flavor that modern buttermilk fudge never has. Real cultured buttermilk gave it a sharp bite. A batch cost about 25 cents to make in 1953. By the 1960s, store-bought buttermilk lost its tang, and the fudge didn't taste right anymore. Buttermilk fudge vanished. Before we move on, many of you asked in the comments where to find these recipes. We even received tons of email, too, so we published these recipes on our website. The link is in the description. Let's continue. It was rich, heavy, and had to be eaten fast before it spoiled. Sour cream candy was the soft, tangy confection made with thick farm sour cream that cultured naturally on the counter. Grandma scooped a cup of sour cream into a pot with sugar and butter. The cream was thick enough to stand a spoon in. She cooked it slowly over low heat, stirring constantly, until it reached soft ball stage. The candy smelled rich and slightly sour. When it was ready, she beat it with a wooden spoon until it thickened and lost its shine. Then she poured it into a buttered pan and let it set. The candy came out soft and fudge-like, with a tangy flavor that balanced the sweetness. It had to be eaten within 3 days or it would spoil. A batch cost about 30 cents to make in 1952. By the 1960s, pasteurized sour cream didn't work the same way. Sour cream candy disappeared. Nobody makes it anymore. They looked like tiny jewels and tasted like flowers. Candied rose petals were the delicate candy made from real garden roses picked in early summer. Grandma went out to the rose bushes in the morning when the dew was still on the petals. She picked the freshest, most fragrant roses and pulled the petals off one by one. In the kitchen, she beat an egg white until it was frothy and painted each petal with a small brush. Then she dusted the petals with superfine sugar and laid them on wax paper to dry overnight. The petals turned stiff and sparkled with sugar crystals. They tasted floral and sweet and dissolved on the tongue. Grandma used them to decorate cakes or ate them as candy. A batch cost nothing but time in 1951. By the 1960s, artificial rose flavoring replaced real petals and nobody wanted to take the time. Candied rose petals vanished. Nobody makes them anymore. Sorghum candy boiled down farm syrup until it snapped. Hickory nut candy cracked wild nuts by hand. Buttermilk fudge used leftover buttermilk from churning. Sour cream candy spoiled in 3 days. Candied rose petals painted real flowers with egg white. These were the farmhouse candies that took all day to make. Nobody makes them anymore. It had a sharp, bright flavor that modern taffy never had. Vinegar taffy was the pantry candy made when the farm ran out of cream and butter. Grandma stood at the stove with a pot of sugar, water, and white vinegar. The vinegar helped the sugar crystallize and gave the taffy a glossy shine. She cooked it to hard crack stage, testing it in cold water until it formed brittle threads. When it was ready, she poured it onto a buttered pan and let it cool until she could handle it. Then she buttered her hands and pulled the taffy over and over, stretching it until it turned from dark amber to pale gold. The pulling made it light and airy. The vinegar gave it a tangy snap. A batch cost about 15 cents to make in 1954. By the 1960s, corn syrup replaced vinegar and the taffy tasted flat. Vinegar taffy vanished. Nobody makes it anymore. It tasted bitter and medicinal, not sweet like regular candy. Horehound candy was the dark drop made from the horehound plant that grew in the farmhouse garden. Grandma picked the fuzzy gray-green leaves in late summer and boiled them in water to make a strong tea. The tea smelled herbal and slightly mentholated. She strained out the leaves and added sugar to the liquid. The mixture cooked down to hard crack stage, thick and dark like molasses. She dropped spoonfuls onto a buttered pan and let them harden into dark brown drops. The candy tasted bitter and earthy with a cooling sensation in the throat. People ate it for sore throats and coughs, not for pleasure. A batch cost almost nothing to make in 1953 if you grew the herb. By the 1960s, cough drops from the drugstore replaced horehound candy. Horehound candy vanished. Nobody makes it anymore. They were so delicate they looked too pretty to eat. Crystallized violets were the sugar-coated flowers made from wild violets that bloomed in the yard every spring. Grandma went out in the early morning and picked the tiniest purple violets she could find. Back in the kitchen, she beat an egg white until it was frothy and painted each violet with a small brush, coating every petal carefully. Then she dusted them with superfine sugar and laid them on wax paper to dry overnight. The violets turned stiff and sparkled with sugar crystals. They tasted floral and sweet with a hint of perfume. Grandma used them to decorate cakes or saved them in a tin to eat as candy. A batch cost nothing but time in 1952. By the 1960s, artificial violet flavoring replaced real flowers, and nobody wanted to gather them. Crystallized violets vanished. Nobody makes them anymore. They tasted fresh and green, not like peppermint extract. Candied mint leaves were the sugar-coated candy made from fresh mint growing in the garden all summer. Grandma picked the youngest, most tender leaves in the morning before the sun got too hot. She washed them and patted them dry with a towel. In the kitchen, she made a simple sugar syrup, sugar and water boiled until thick, and dipped each leaf into the hot syrup with a fork. The leaves went onto wax paper to dry. When they hardened, they were stiff and coated with a thick layer of crystallized sugar. They tasted like fresh mint with a sweet crunch. The leaves stayed green and looked beautiful in a glass jar. A batch cost nothing but time in 1951. By the 1960s, peppermint oil replaced fresh mint, and nobody wanted to dip leaves one by one. Candied mint leaves vanished. Nobody makes them anymore. It tasted almost bitter, right on the edge of burnt. Burnt sugar candy was the dark, hard candy made by cooking sugar until it turned deep amber and smelled smoky. Grandma stood at the stove with a heavy pot and poured in 2 cups of white sugar. No water, no butter, just sugar. She cooked it over medium heat, stirring constantly until it melted and turned golden. Then she kept cooking it, watching it carefully until it turned dark brown and started to smell bitter. Right before it burned, she poured it onto a buttered pan and let it cool. The candy came out dark and glossy with a complex, almost burnt flavor. It wasn't just sweet. It tasted caramelized and smoky. A batch cost about 10 cents to make in 1953. By the 1960s, people wanted candy that was only sweet. Burnt sugar candy vanished. Nobody makes it anymore. Taffy pulled with buttered hands until it turned pale gold. Horehound candy boiled bitter herb tea into dark drops. Crystallized violets painted spring flowers with egg white. Candied mint leaves dipped fresh garden mint in sugar syrup. Burnt sugar candy cooked until it smelled smoky. These were the lost farmhouse candies. Nobody makes them anymore. It sounded strange, but it tasted like heaven. Potato candy was the farmhouse treat made with leftover mashed potatoes and powdered sugar. Grandma took a small potato left over from dinner and mashed it smooth with a fork. She mixed it with enough powdered sugar to make a stiff dough. The potato made it creamy without adding cream or butter. She rolled the dough out thin on a counter dusted with powdered sugar. Then she spread peanut butter across the dough in a thin layer. She rolled it up like a jelly roll and sliced it into pinwheels. Each slice had a spiral of white dough and brown peanut butter. The candy tasted sweet and creamy with a hint of peanut butter. The potato was invisible. You couldn't taste it at all. A batch cost about 20 cents to make in 1954. By the 1960s, people thought it sounded too strange. Potato candy vanished. Nobody makes it anymore. It was lighter than air and tasted like brown sugar and vanilla. Seafoam candy was the farmhouse version of divinity made with brown sugar instead of white. Grandma stood at the stove with a pot of brown sugar, corn syrup, and water boiling on the burner. She cooked it to hardball stage while she beat 2 egg whites in a bowl until they were stiff. When the syrup was ready, she poured it in a thin stream into the egg whites, beating constantly. The mixture turned into fluffy, tan-colored peaks. She added vanilla and dropped spoonfuls onto wax paper. The candy dried into light, airy pieces that dissolved on the tongue. It tasted like caramel and vanilla. The brown sugar gave it a molasses flavor that white divinity never had. A batch cost about 30 cents to make in 1953. By the 1970s, humidity made it sticky, and it stopped setting right. Seafoam candy vanished. Nobody makes it anymore. It took hours of pulling to turn it from dark brown to golden. Pulled molasses taffy was the chewy candy made every fall when the molasses barrel was full. Grandma stood at the stove with a pot of molasses, sugar, and butter boiling together. She cooked it to hard ball stage, testing it in cold water until it formed a firm ball. When it was ready, she poured it onto a buttered pan and let it cool until she could handle it. Then she buttered her hands and started pulling. The taffy was dark brown and sticky at first. She pulled it over and over, stretching it out and folding it back. After an hour of pulling, the taffy turned pale gold and had a satiny sheen. It tasted rich and chewy with a deep molasses flavor. A batch cost about 40 cents to make in 1952. By the 1960s, nobody wanted to pull taffy for an hour. Pulled molasses taffy vanished. Nobody makes it anymore. It was lighter in color than chocolate fudge and tasted like maple. Opera fudge was the farmhouse candy made in Ohio and Pennsylvania in the 1950s. Grandma stood at the stove with a pot of brown sugar, heavy cream, and butter. She cooked it slowly, stirring constantly, until it reached soft ball stage. The fudge smelled sweet and creamy while it cooked. When it was ready, she took it off the heat and beat it with a wooden spoon until it thickened and lost its shine. Then she poured it into a buttered pan and let it cool. The fudge came out pale tan and softer than chocolate fudge. It tasted like brown sugar and maple with a creamy texture. The heavy cream made it rich. A batch cost about 40 cents to make in 1954. By the 1960s, chocolate fudge took over and opera fudge seemed old-fashioned. Opera fudge vanished. Nobody makes it anymore. It tasted wild and strong, not mild like regular fudge. Black walnut fudge was the farmhouse candy made with nuts gathered from the woods every fall. Grandma sent the kids out to collect black walnuts from under the trees. The nuts had thick green holes that stained their hands brown. Back at the house, they cracked the shells with a hammer and picked out the nut meats. Black walnuts tasted stronger and more bitter than English walnuts. Grandma made chocolate fudge on the stove. Sugar, cocoa, milk, and butter cooked to soft ball stage. She beat it until it thickened and stirred in the black walnuts at the end. The fudge came out dark and rich with chunks of strong-flavored nuts. The black walnuts gave it an earthy, almost pungent taste. A batch cost about 30 cents to make in 1953. By the 1960s, English walnuts were easier to buy. Black walnut fudge vanished. Nobody makes it anymore. Potato candy rolled mashed potatoes with peanut butter. Seafoam candy beat brown sugar syrup into egg whites. Pulled molasses taffy pulled for an hour until it turned gold. Opera fudge tasted like maple and cream. Black walnut fudge used wild nuts from the woods. These were the farmhouse staples that took all day. Nobody makes them anymore. It had to cure for days before it was ready to eat. Date roll was the farmhouse candy made every Christmas with dates, walnuts, and powdered sugar. Grandma stood at the counter with a bowl of pitted dates and ran them through the meat grinder. The dates came out in a thick, sticky paste. She mixed in chopped walnuts and a little powdered sugar until it held together. Then she shaped the mixture into a log about 2 inches thick and rolled it in more powdered sugar until it was coated completely. The log went into the cellar to cure for 3 days. The cool air made it firm up. When it was ready, she sliced it into rounds. Each slice had dates and nuts suspended in a sweet, chewy roll. It tasted rich and fruity. A batch cost about 50 cents to make in 1955. By the 1960s, nobody wanted to wait 3 days. Date roll vanished. Nobody makes it anymore. It was the base for every candy center in the farmhouse. No-cook fondant was the white dough-like candy made with Caro corn syrup and powdered sugar. Grandma stood at the counter with a bowl and poured in half a cup of light corn syrup. She added powdered sugar a cup at a time, stirring with a wooden spoon until the mixture was too stiff to stir. Then she kneaded it with her hands like bread dough, adding more powdered sugar until it wasn't sticky. The fondant came out smooth and white like Play-Doh. She flavored it with vanilla, peppermint, or maple extract and shaped it into balls or patties. The fondant dried for a day and then got dipped in melted chocolate. It tasted sweet and creamy and melted on the tongue. A batch cost about 30 cents to make in 1952. By the 1970s, store-bought candy centers replaced homemade fondant. No-cook fondant vanished. Nobody makes it anymore. It tasted like flowers and sunshine. Honey taffy was the farmhouse candy made with pure honey from the farm beehives. Grandma stood at the stove with a pot of honey. Nothing else, just honey. She cooked it slowly over low heat until it reached hard crack stage. The honey bubbled and darkened as it cooked. She tested it by dropping a spoonful into cold water until it formed brittle threads. When it was ready, she poured it onto a buttered pan and let it cool until she could handle it. Then she buttered her hands and pulled the taffy, stretching it out and folding it back. The taffy turned from dark amber to pale gold. It tasted like honey with a chewy texture. The floral flavor came through in every bite. A batch cost about 60 cents to make in 1954. By the 1960s, corn syrup replaced honey, and the flavor was never the same. Honey taffy vanished. Nobody makes it anymore. It was pure maple syrup whipped until it turned into candy. Maple cream was the farmhouse treat made every spring during sugaring season. Grandma stood at the stove with a pot of pure maple syrup, the kind they made from their own trees. She boiled it to soft ball stage, watching it carefully so it wouldn't burn. When it was ready, she poured it into a bowl and let it cool until it was just warm. Then she beat it with a wooden spoon. The syrup turned from liquid to cream right before her eyes. It went from dark and glossy to light and opaque. She kept beating until it thickened into a spreadable consistency like peanut butter. The maple cream tasted intensely sweet and mapley. It was smooth and melted on the tongue. A batch cost nothing but time if you made your own syrup in 1953. By the 1960s, maple syrup became expensive and nobody had time to make it. Maple cream vanished. Nobody makes it anymore. It was simple, brittle, and tasted like pure caramel. Brown sugar candy was the farmhouse candy made with nothing but brown sugar, butter, and water. Grandma stood at the stove with a heavy pot and poured in 2 cups of packed brown sugar. She added a tablespoon of butter and a 1/4 cup of water. Then the mixture cooked over medium heat, stirring constantly until it reached hard crack stage. She tested it by dropping a spoonful into cold water until it formed brittle threads. When it was ready, she poured it onto a buttered pan and let it cool completely. The candy hardened into a thin sheet that cracked into pieces. It tasted rich and caramel-like with a deep molasses flavor from the brown sugar. The butter made it smooth. A batch cost about 20 cents to make in 1951. By the 1960s, people wanted fancier candy with chocolate or nuts. Brown sugar candy vanished. Nobody makes it anymore. Date: roll cured in the cellar for 3 days. No cook fondant, kneaded powdered sugar with corn syrup. Honey taffy pulled pure honey until it turned gold. Maple cream beat boiled syrup until it turned opaque. Brown sugar candy poured thin and cracked into pieces. These were the farmhouse staples nobody wanted to wait for. Nobody makes them anymore. They were the fancy candy Grandma made for Christmas and wrapped in wax paper. Cream walnuts were the hand-dipped farmhouse treat, made with walnut halves and homemade fondant. Grandma stood at the kitchen counter with a bowl of no-cook fondant she had made the day before. Powdered sugar, corn syrup, and vanilla kneaded until smooth. She pinched off small pieces of fondant and pressed a walnut half into each piece, sandwiching the nut between 2 layers of white fondant. The fondant dried for a day on wax paper until it was firm enough to handle. Then she melted chocolate in a double boiler, real chocolate, walnut candy coating, and dipped each walnut fondant into the melted chocolate with a fork. The excess chocolate dripped off, and she set each piece back on the wax paper to harden. The cream walnuts came out glossy and dark, with the walnut visible through the chocolate if you held it up to the light. Each piece had a creamy white center and a crunchy walnut. They tasted sweet and nutty and melted on the tongue. The fondant was soft and the chocolate was rich. Grandma put them in a tin lined with wax paper and gave them as gifts. A batch cost about 50 cents to make in 1954 and made about 3 dozen pieces. By the 1970s, store-bought chocolates were easier and cheaper than making them by hand. Dipping each piece in chocolate took hours. Cream walnuts vanished from farmhouse kitchens. Nobody makes them anymore. It was the candy made from the part of the fruit everyone else threw away. Candied grapefruit peel was the farmhouse treat made to ensure nothing went to waste. Grandma saved the thick peel from grapefruit after breakfast. She cut the peel into strips about a 1/4 inch wide, leaving a little of the white pith attached. The peel went into a pot of cold water and boiled for 10 minutes. She drained it and did it again, boiled it in fresh water and drained it. The 3rd time she boiled it, the bitterness was gone and the peel was soft. Then she made a simple syrup. 2 cups of sugar and 1 cup of water boiled until the sugar dissolved. The grapefruit peel went into the syrup and simmered for an hour until it turned translucent and glossy. She lifted the peel out with a fork and laid each strip on wax paper to dry. The peel dried overnight and turned slightly stiff. She rolled each strip in granulated sugar to keep them from sticking together. The candied peel tasted sweet and slightly bitter with a chewy texture. The sugar coating crunched when you bit into it. Grandma kept them in a tin and ate them like candy. A batch cost almost nothing to make in 1952 if you had grapefruit. By the 1960s, people didn't want to spend hours boiling peel 3 times. Candied grapefruit peel vanished from farmhouse kitchens. Nobody makes it anymore. It was sweeter than grapefruit peel and took just as long to make. Candied orange peel was the farmhouse candy made from orange rinds, saved after eating the fruit. Grandma peeled the oranges carefully, trying to get the peel off in big pieces. She cut the peel into strips about a 1/4 inch wide and scraped off most of the white pith with a spoon, leaving just a thin layer so the strips wouldn't fall apart. The peel went into a pot of cold water and boiled for 10 minutes to remove the bitterness. She drained it and repeated the process 2 more times with fresh water. After the 3rd boiling, the peel was soft and had lost most of its bitterness. Then she made a heavy sugar syrup. 2 cups of sugar and 1 cup of water boiled together until thick and clear. The orange peel went into the syrup and simmered for over an hour. She stirred it occasionally and watched it turn translucent and glossy. When the peel was ready, she lifted each strip out with a fork and laid them on wax paper to dry overnight. The peel dried into chewy, slightly stiff strips. She rolled them in granulated sugar to coat them and keep them from sticking together. The candied orange peel tasted intensely sweet with a bright orange flavor. The sugar coating added crunch. A batch cost about 30 cents to make in 1953. By the 1960s, people threw away orange peels instead of saving them. Candied orange peel vanished from farmhouse kitchens. Nobody makes it anymore. They melted instantly on the tongue, not like the hard mints you buy at the store. Pulled buttermints were the soft, creamy candies Grandma made for weddings and special occasions. She stood at the stove with a pot of sugar, butter, heavy cream, and a little water. The mixture cooked slowly over medium heat until it reached soft ball stage. She tested it by dropping a spoonful into cold water until it formed a soft ball. When it was ready, she poured it onto a buttered marble slab and let it cool until she could handle it. Then she added a few drops of peppermint oil, not extract, pure peppermint oil, and started pulling the candy. She buttered her hands and stretched the candy out and folded it back, over and over, for about 10 minutes. The candy started out glossy and translucent. As she pulled it, it turned opaque and creamy white. The pulling incorporated tiny air bubbles that made it light and soft. When it was the right consistency, she rolled it into a long rope and cut it into small pieces with scissors. Each piece was shaped like a little pillow. The mints dried for a day on wax paper and turned slightly firm on the outside, but stayed soft inside. They tasted buttery and minty and dissolved on the tongue. A batch cost about 40 cents to make in 1955. By the 1970s, hard after-dinner mints replaced soft buttermints. Pulled buttermints vanished from farmhouse kitchens. Nobody makes them anymore. It was the two-tone candy that looked like it came from a fancy candy shop. Coconut ice was the farmhouse treat made with shredded coconut, powdered sugar, and condensed milk. Grandma stood at the counter with a bowl and mixed 2 cups of shredded coconut with 2 cups of powdered sugar. She added half a can of sweetened condensed milk and stirred it with a wooden spoon until it formed a thick, sticky dough. The dough was white and smelled like coconut and vanilla. She pressed half the mixture into a buttered pan, spreading it out evenly with the back of a spoon. Then she tinted the other half pink with a drop or two of red food coloring. The pink mixture went on top of the white layer, and she pressed it down firmly so the layers would stick together. The coconut ice went into the refrigerator to set for several hours. When it was firm, she cut it into small squares with a knife. Each square had a white bottom and a pink top. The candy was dense and sweet with a coconut flavor. It tasted like marzipan, but with coconut instead of almonds. The texture was firm and slightly grainy from the powdered sugar. A batch cost about 50 cents to make in 1954 and filled a whole pan. By the 1960s, coconut ice seemed old-fashioned and too plain. People wanted candy with chocolate or nuts. Coconut ice vanished from farmhouse kitchens. Nobody makes it anymore. Cream. Walnuts dipped each piece in melted chocolate by hand. Candied grapefruit. Peel boiled 3 times to remove bitterness. Candied orange peel simmered in syrup for an hour. Pulled buttermints pulled until they turned creamy white. Coconut ice layered pink and white coconut fondant. These were the farmhouse candies that took all day to make. Nobody makes them anymore. It was lighter and fluffier than regular fudge because of the homemade marshmallow. Marshmallow fudge was the farmhouse candy made by folding whipped marshmallow into chocolate fudge. Grandma started by making the marshmallow from scratch. No marshmallow fluff from a jar. She beat 2 egg whites in a bowl until they were stiff and formed peaks. On the stove, she boiled sugar, corn syrup, and water to hard ball stage. When the syrup was ready, she poured it in a thin stream into the egg whites, beating constantly with a hand mixer. The mixture turned white and fluffy and tripled in volume. That was the marshmallow. She set it aside and made chocolate fudge on the stove. Sugar, cocoa, milk, and butter cooked to softball stage. When the fudge was ready, she took it off the heat and beat it with a wooden spoon until it started to thicken. Then she folded in the marshmallow, stirring gently until it was just combined. The fudge turned light and airy with streaks of white marshmallow throughout. She poured it into a buttered pan and let it set for several hours. The fudge came out soft and creamy with a fluffy texture. It tasted like chocolate and vanilla and melted on the tongue. A batch cost about 40 cents to make in 1953. By the 1960s, marshmallow fluff replaced homemade marshmallow, and the texture was never the same. Marshmallow fudge vanished from farmhouse kitchens. Nobody makes it anymore. They tasted sweet, salty, and spicy all at the same time. Spiced nuts were the farmhouse candy made with pecans, or walnuts coated in caramelized sugar and spices. Grandma spread 2 cups of nut halves on a baking sheet and toasted them in a low oven until they smelled nutty. While the nuts toasted, she made the coating on the stove. In a heavy pot, she mixed a cup of sugar, a 1/4 cup of water, a teaspoon of cinnamon, and a pinch of salt. She cooked it over medium heat without stirring until it reached soft ball stage. The sugar syrup turned amber and smelled like caramel and cinnamon. When it was ready, she poured the hot nuts into the syrup and stirred quickly with a wooden spoon until every nut was coated. Then she spread the coated nuts back onto the buttered baking sheet, separating them with a fork so they wouldn't stick together in clumps. The nuts cooled and the sugar coating hardened into a crunchy shell. Each nut was glossy and coated with a thick layer of spiced sugar. They tasted sweet from the sugar, warm from the cinnamon, and salty from the salt. The nuts were crunchy and addictive. Grandma kept them in a tin and served them at Christmas. A batch cost about 60 cents to make in 1955. By the 1970s, store-bought candied nuts were easier to buy than to make. Spiced nuts vanished from farmhouse kitchens. Nobody makes them anymore. It was the soft, melt-in-your-mouth candy that had to be kept in a cool place, or it would soften. Cream candy was the farmhouse treat made with heavy cream, sugar, and butter. Grandma stood at the stove with a heavy pot and poured in 2 cups of heavy cream, the thick kind that came from the farm separator. She added 2 cups of sugar and a tablespoon of butter. The mixture cooked slowly over low heat, stirring constantly until it reached soft ball stage. She tested it by dropping a spoonful into cold water until it formed a soft ball. The candy smelled rich and sweet while it cooked. When it was ready, she took it off the heat and let it cool for a few minutes. Then she beat it with a wooden spoon until it thickened and lost its shine. She added vanilla extract and kept beating until the candy was thick and creamy. Then she poured it into a buttered pan and let it set in a cool place, the cellar or the back porch in winter. The candy firmed up but stayed soft and creamy. It tasted rich and buttery and melted on the tongue. The heavy cream made it smooth. A batch cost about 50 cents to make in 1952. By the 1960s, people didn't have cool cellars to store it in, and the candy would soften in warm kitchens. Cream candy vanished from farmhouse kitchens. Nobody makes it anymore. They were the precursor to Rice Krispie treats, but made with popcorn and dark molasses. Candied popcorn squares were the farmhouse candy made by pressing molasses-coated popcorn into a pan. Grandma popped a big pot of popcorn on the stove in a little oil. The popcorn went into a large bowl, and she picked out any unpopped kernels. On the stove, she made a thick molasses syrup, 1 cup of molasses, 1 cup of sugar, and a tablespoon of butter cooked to soft crack stage. She tested it by dropping a spoonful into cold water until it formed hard threads. When the syrup was ready, she poured it over the popcorn and stirred quickly with a wooden spoon until every kernel was coated. Then she pressed the sticky popcorn into a buttered 9 by 13 pan, packing it down firmly with the back of a spoon. The popcorn had to be pressed tight or it would fall apart when cut. The squares cooled and hardened into firm bars. When they were set, she cut them into squares with a knife. Each square was dark and sticky, with popcorn held together by thick molasses. They tasted sweet and chewy with a hint of bitterness from the molasses. The popcorn stayed crunchy inside. A batch cost about 25 cents to make in 1951. By the 1960s, marshmallow treats replaced molasses popcorn squares. Candied popcorn squares vanished from farmhouse kitchens. Nobody makes them anymore. They were heavy, crumbly, and tasted like pure caramel and pecans. Brown sugar pralines were the southern farmhouse candy, made with brown sugar, cream, and pecans. Grandma stood at the stove with a heavy pot and poured in 2 cups of packed brown sugar. She added a cup of heavy cream and a tablespoon of butter. The mixture cooked over medium heat, stirring constantly until it reached soft ball stage. She tested it by dropping a spoonful into cold water until it formed a soft ball. The pralines smelled rich and caramel-like while they cooked. When the mixture was ready, she took it off the heat and stirred in 2 cups of pecan halves, pecans from the farm trees that the kids had shelled the week before. She beat the mixture with a wooden spoon until it started to thicken and lose its shine. Then she worked quickly, dropping spoonfuls onto wax paper before it hardened in the pot. Each praline had to be dropped fast because the candy set up quickly. The pralines cooled into thick, irregular discs with pecans throughout. They were heavy and crumbly with a grainy texture. They tasted like brown sugar and butter with crunchy pecans in every bite. The pralines melted on the tongue, but the pecans stayed crunchy. A batch cost about 60 cents to make in 1954. By the 1970s, smooth, creamy pralines replaced the crumbly farmhouse version. Brown sugar pralines vanished from farmhouse kitchens. Nobody makes them anymore. Marshmallow fudge folded homemade marshmallow into chocolate. Spiced nuts coated pecans in cinnamon sugar. Cream candy beat heavy cream until it thickened. Candied popcorn squares pressed molasses popcorn into a pan. Brown sugar pralines dropped thick caramel and pecans onto wax paper. These were the farmhouse staples that set up fast. Nobody makes them anymore. It looked like clouds and tasted like vanilla and sugar. Divinity was the farmhouse candy made by beating hot sugar syrup into egg whites until it formed stiff, glossy peaks. Grandma stood at the stove with a pot of sugar, corn syrup, and water boiling together. She cooked it to hard ball stage, testing it by dropping a spoonful into cold water until it formed a hard ball. While the syrup cooked, she beat 2 egg whites in a large bowl until they were stiff and formed peaks. When the syrup was ready, she poured it in a thin stream into the egg whites, beating constantly with a hand mixer. The mixture turned white and fluffy and held its shape. She added vanilla extract and kept beating until the divinity was thick and glossy. Then she dropped spoonfuls onto wax paper. Each piece looked like a white cloud. The divinity had to dry for several hours until the outside formed a slight crust, but the inside stayed soft. On a humid day, the divinity would never set. It would stay sticky forever. Grandma only made it on cool, dry days. The divinity tasted sweet and vanilla-y and dissolved on the tongue. It was light and airy with a marshmallow-like texture. A batch cost about 30 cents to make in 1952. By the 1970s, people didn't understand the humidity rule, and their divinity wouldn't set. They gave up making it. Divinity vanished from farmhouse kitchens. Nobody makes it anymore. It tasted like maple syrup even though there was no maple in it. Panouche fudge was the farmhouse candy made with brown sugar, milk, and butter. Grandma stood at the stove with a heavy pot and poured in 2 cups of packed brown sugar. She added a cup of milk and a tablespoon of butter. The mixture cooked over medium heat, stirring constantly until it reached soft ball stage. She tested it by dropping a spoonful into cold water until it formed a soft ball. The fudge smelled sweet and caramel-like while it cooked. When it was ready, she took it off the heat and let it cool slightly. Then she beat it with a wooden spoon until it thickened and lost its shine. The fudge went from glossy to matte as she beat it. She poured it into a buttered pan and let it set for several hours. The fudge came out pale tan and smooth with a creamy texture. It tasted like brown sugar and butter with a flavor that reminded you of maple syrup, even though there was no maple in it. The brown sugar gave it that maple-like flavor. The texture was soft and creamy, not grainy like some fudge. A batch cost about 30 cents to make in 1953. By the 1970s, chocolate fudge dominated and brown sugar fudge seemed plain. The specific maple meats, brown sugar profile became rare. Panouche fudge vanished from farmhouse kitchens. Nobody makes it anymore. It would break your teeth if you bit down too hard. Butter Crunch was the farmhouse toffee candy made with butter, sugar, and nuts. Grandma stood at the stove with a heavy pot and poured in 2 cups of sugar and a stick of butter. She cooked it over medium heat, stirring constantly until the butter melted and the mixture turned golden. She kept cooking it, watching it carefully, until it reached hard crack stage. She tested it by dropping a spoonful into cold water until it formed hard, brittle threads. The toffee smelled buttery and caramel-like. When it was ready, she stirred in a cup of chopped almonds or pecans and poured the whole thing onto a buttered baking sheet. The toffee spread out thin across the pan. While it was still hot, she scored it with a knife into squares so it would break cleanly when cool. Sometimes she spread melted chocolate on top and sprinkled more chopped nuts over the chocolate. The butter crunch cooled and hardened into a brittle candy that snapped when you broke it. It tasted buttery and sweet with a deep caramel flavor. The nuts added crunch and richness. The candy was so hard it could break a tooth if you weren't careful. A batch cost about 50 cents to make in 1954. By the 1970s, store-bought English toffee replaced homemade Butter Crunch. Butter Crunch vanished from farmhouse kitchens. Nobody makes it anymore. They were dark, sticky, and tasted like molasses and butter. Popcorn balls were the farmhouse candy made every Halloween and Christmas. Grandma popped a big pot of popcorn on the stove and poured it into a large bowl. She picked out the unpopped kernels and any burnt pieces. On the stove, she made a thick syrup, 1 cup of molasses, 1 cup of sugar, a 1/4 cup of butter, and a tablespoon of vinegar cooked to soft crack stage. She tested it by dropping a spoonful into cold water until it formed hard threads. The syrup was dark and smelled sweet and slightly bitter from the molasses. When it was ready, she poured it over the popcorn and stirred quickly with a wooden spoon until every kernel was coated. Then she buttered her hands and started forming balls. She grabbed a handful of the sticky popcorn and squeezed it into a tight ball about the size of a baseball. The molasses held the popcorn together. She wrapped each ball in wax paper and twisted the ends closed. The popcorn balls were dark brown and sticky with a glossy coating. They tasted sweet from the sugar and slightly bitter from the molasses. The butter made them rich. The popcorn stayed crunchy inside, even though the outside was sticky. A batch cost about 20 cents to make in 1951 and made about a dozen balls. They tasted like real browned butter, not artificial butterscotch flavoring. Butterscotch drops were the farmhouse candy made by browning butter with sugar until it caramelized. Grandma stood at the stove with a heavy pot and melted a stick of butter over medium heat. Then she added 2 cups of sugar and a 1/4 cup of water. The mixture cooked together, stirring constantly, then until it reached hard crack stage. She tested it by dropping a spoonful into cold water until it formed hard, brittle threads. The candy smelled rich and buttery with a caramel undertone. When it was ready, she dropped spoonfuls onto a buttered baking sheet. Each drop spread out into a thin disk. The candy cooled and hardened into glossy, golden drops. They tasted like butter and caramel with a hint of nuttiness from the browned butter. The flavor was complex and rich, not just sweet. Modern butterscotch flavoring can't replicate the taste of real browned butter. Each drop was hard and dissolved slowly on the tongue. A batch cost about 30 cents to make in 1952. By the 1960s, artificial butterscotch flavoring replaced real browned butter and the candy tasted flat and chemical. The real butterscotch flavor disappeared. Butterscotch drops vanished from farmhouse kitchens. Nobody makes them anymore. Divinity beat hot syrup into egg whites until fluffy. Panouche fudge tasted like maple from brown sugar. Buttercrunch broke teeth with hard toffee. Popcorn balls squeezed sticky molasses, popcorn by hand. Butterscotch drops browned butter until it smelled nutty. These were the farmhouse candies that needed perfect weather and timing. Nobody makes them anymore. It was pure maple syrup boiled down and molded into shapes. Maple sugar candy was the farmhouse treat made every spring during sugaring season. Grandma stood at the stove with a pot of pure maple syrup, the kind they made from their own trees by boiling down the sap for hours. She took the finished syrup and boiled it again to a higher temperature, stirring constantly so it wouldn't burn. The syrup had to reach soft ball stage. She tested it by dropping a spoonful into cold water until it formed a soft ball. When it was ready, she took it off the heat and let it cool slightly. Then she beat it with a wooden spoon until it started to thicken and turn lighter in color. She poured the thickened syrup into small metal molds shaped like maple leaves, or poured it onto a buttered pan and let it harden. The candy set up firm and smooth. When it was hard, she popped the shapes out of the molds or cut the sheet into squares. The maple candy was pale tan and tasted intensely of maple, sweet and rich with that distinct maple flavor. It was hard but melted on the tongue. A batch cost nothing but time if you made your own syrup in 1953. By the 1960s, maple syrup became too expensive to use for candy and people stopped making their own. Maple sugar candy vanished from farmhouse kitchens. Nobody makes it anymore. They were the hand-rolled centers dipped in chocolate coating. Coconut bonbons were the farmhouse candy made with shredded coconut, powdered sugar, and condensed milk rolled into balls and dipped in chocolate. Grandma stood at the counter with a bowl and mixed 2 cups of shredded coconut with 1 cup of powdered sugar. She added half a can of sweetened condensed milk and stirred it until it formed a thick, sticky dough. The dough smelled like coconut and vanilla. She rolled the dough into balls about the size of a walnut and placed them on wax paper to dry for a few hours. The balls firmed up slightly but stayed soft inside. Then she melted chocolate in a double boiler. She used paraffin wax mixed with the chocolate to make it shiny and keep it from melting at room temperature. She dipped each coconut ball into the melted chocolate with a fork, coating it completely, and let the excess drip off. The bonbons went back onto wax paper to harden. The chocolate coating set up firm and glossy. Each bonbon had a soft, sweet coconut center and a thin chocolate shell. They tasted like a Mounds bar, but homemade. The coconut was moist and the chocolate was smooth. A batch cost about 50 cents to make in 1955 and made about 2 dozen bonbons. By the 1970s, store-bought chocolate-covered coconut candies replaced homemade bonbons. Coconut bonbons vanished from farmhouse kitchens. Nobody makes them anymore. It was heavy on the salt and butter and light on the corn syrup. Caramel corn was the farmhouse candy made by coating popcorn with thick caramel and baking it until crispy. Grandma popped a big pot of popcorn on the stove and spread it out on 2 large baking sheets. On the stove, she made the caramel, a stick of butter, a cup of brown sugar, a 1/4 cup of corn syrup, and a teaspoon of salt. The mixture cooked over medium heat, stirring constantly, until it reached soft ball stage. When it was ready, she stirred in a teaspoon of baking soda. The caramel foamed up and turned lighter in color. She poured the hot caramel over the popcorn and stirred it with a wooden spoon until every kernel was coated. The baking sheets went into a low oven, 250 degrees, and baked for an hour. She stirred the popcorn every 15 minutes so it would coat evenly and not burn. When it came out, and the caramel corn was crispy and golden, it cooled on the pans and she broke it into clusters. The caramel corn tasted buttery and salty with a deep caramel flavor from the brown sugar. It was crunchy and addictive. The salt balanced the sweetness. A batch cost about 40 cents to make in 1954 and filled 2 big bowls. By the 1980s, store-bought caramel corn was easier to buy. Caramel corn vanished from farmhouse kitchens. Nobody makes it anymore. It was grainy and crumbly, not smooth like modern fudge. Chocolate fudge was the old-fashioned farmhouse candy made without marshmallows or condensed milk. Grandma stood at the stove with a heavy pot and poured in 2 cups of sugar, 3 tablespoons of cocoa powder, a cup of milk, and a tablespoon of butter. She cooked it over medium heat, stirring constantly, until it reached soft ball stage. She tested it by dropping a spoonful into cold water until it formed a soft ball. The fudge smelled chocolatey and sweet while it cooked. When it was ready, she took it off the heat and let it cool for a few minutes without stirring. Then she beat it with a wooden spoon until it thickened and lost its shine. The fudge went from glossy to matte and started to firm up. She poured it into a buttered pan and let it set for several hours. The fudge came out with a slightly grainy texture, not smooth and creamy like fudge made with marshmallow fluff. It had a more intense chocolate flavor and was firmer. You could cut it into neat squares that held their shape. It tasted deeply chocolatey and sweet. A batch cost about 35 cents to make in 1951. By the 1970s, smooth fudge made with marshmallow fluff replaced the old-fashioned grainy kind. The texture people grew up with disappeared. Chocolate fudge vanished from farmhouse kitchens. Nobody makes it anymore. It was made with raw peanuts straight from the farm, not roasted peanuts from a can. Peanut brittle was the farmhouse candy made every fall after the peanut harvest. Grandma stood at the stove with a heavy pot and poured in 2 cups of sugar, 1 cup of corn syrup, and a 1/4 cup of water. She cooked it over medium heat, stirring constantly until it reached hard crack stage. When the syrup was ready, golden and thick, she stirred in 2 cups of raw peanuts. The peanuts cooked in the hot syrup for a few minutes until they were toasted and fragrant. Then she added a tablespoon of butter and a teaspoon of baking soda. The mixture foamed up and turned lighter in color. She poured it quickly onto a buttered baking sheet and spread it thin with a spatula. The brittle had to be thin, or it would be too hard to bite. It cooled on the counter and hardened into a thin sheet. When it was completely cool, she broke it into pieces. The peanut brittle was golden and translucent with peanuts throughout. It tasted sweet and nutty with a hint of caramel. The peanuts were crunchy and the brittle snapped when you broke it. Raw peanuts tasted different from roasted ones. They were softer and more earthy. A batch cost about 40 cents to make in 1952. By the 1960s, roasted peanuts replaced raw ones and the flavor changed. Peanut brittle vanished from farmhouse kitchens. Nobody makes it anymore. Maple sugar candy molded boiled syrup into shapes. Coconut bonbons rolled coconut into balls and dipped them in chocolate. Caramel corn baked popcorn in the oven for an hour. Chocolate fudge beat until it turned grainy. Peanut brittle cooked raw peanuts in hot syrup. These were the farmhouse candies everybody knew how to make. They were soft, chewy, and wrapped in individual wax paper squares. Cream caramels were the farmhouse candy made with heavy cream, sugar, and butter that took patience and constant stirring. Grandma stood at the stove with a heavy pot and poured in 2 cups of sugar, a cup of heavy cream, the thick kind that came from the farm separator, a cup of corn syrup, and a stick of butter. She cooked it over medium heat, stirring constantly with a wooden spoon. The mixture had to be stirred the entire time, or it would burn on the bottom. She stirred for what felt like forever, watching the mixture bubble and thicken. The kitchen filled with the sweet smell of caramelizing sugar and butter. After about 30 minutes of constant stirring, the mixture reached firm ball stage. She tested it by dropping a spoonful into cold water until it formed a firm ball that held its shape but was still pliable. When it was ready, she added a teaspoon of vanilla and poured the hot caramel into a buttered 9x9 pan. The caramel had to cool completely, several hours or overnight, before she could cut it. When it was firm, she turned it out onto a cutting board and cut it into small rectangles with a buttered knife. Each piece was golden brown and slightly sticky. She wrapped each caramel individually in a square of wax paper, twisting the ends closed so they looked like little presents. The caramels were soft and chewy with a rich, buttery flavor. They tasted like pure caramel, sweet with a hint of salt from the butter. The heavy cream made them smooth and creamy, not grainy. Each piece stuck to your teeth slightly when you chewed it. A batch cost about 60 cents to make in 1955 and made about 4 dozen caramels. Grandma kept them in a tin and gave them as gifts at Christmas. The caramels stayed soft for weeks if they were wrapped properly. By the 1970s, store-bought caramels were easier to buy than to make, and nobody wanted to stand at the stove stirring for 30 minutes. The individually wrapped homemade caramels disappeared from farmhouse kitchens. Cream caramels vanished. Nobody makes them anymore. They were thick, doughy, and tasted like fresh peppermint, not artificial flavoring. Peppermint patties were the farmhouse candy made with homemade fondant and peppermint oil. Grandma stood at the counter and made a batch of no-cook fondant, half a cup of corn syrup mixed with enough powdered sugar to make a stiff dough. She kneaded it with her hands until it was smooth and no longer sticky. Then she added a few drops of pure peppermint oil, not extract, the concentrated oil, and kneaded it again until the peppermint was distributed throughout. The fondant turned white and smelled intensely minty. She pinched off pieces of fondant and rolled them into balls about the size of a walnut. Then she flattened each ball into a thick disc, about half an inch thick, and placed them on wax paper to dry overnight. The patties had to dry until they formed a slight crust on the outside, but stayed soft inside. The next day, she melted chocolate in a double boiler. She used real chocolate mixed with a little paraffin wax to make it shiny and keep it from melting at room temperature. She dipped each fondant patty into the melted chocolate with a fork, coating it completely. The excess chocolate dripped off, and she set each patty back on wax paper to harden. The chocolate coating set up firm and glossy. Each peppermint patty had a thick, soft fondant center and a thin chocolate shell. They looked like the York peppermint patties you buy at the store, but they were thicker and the fondant was doughier. The patties tasted intensely minty with a creamy fondant center. The chocolate was dark and rich. The peppermint oil gave them a cooling sensation on the tongue. The fondant was soft and dissolved slowly. A batch cost about 50 cents to make in 1954 and made about 2 dozen patties. Grandma served them at church socials and holiday gatherings. The thick, doughy fondant was what made them special. They weren't thin and crispy like modern peppermint patties. By the 1970s, store-bought York peppermint patties dominated, and the homemade thick fondant style seemed old-fashioned. Peppermint patties vanished from farmhouse kitchens. Nobody makes them anymore. They were whole cherries preserved in thick sugar syrup at home, not the bright red dyed ones from the store. Candied cherries were the farmhouse candy made every June when the cherry trees were heavy with fruit. Grandma picked the cherries early in the morning before the sun got too hot. She used a cherry pitter to remove the pits, working over a bowl to catch the juice. The cherries had to stay whole with the stems still attached, if possible. In a heavy pot, she made a thick sugar syrup. 2 cups of sugar and 1 cup of water boiled together until the sugar dissolved and the syrup turned clear and thick. The cherries went into the hot syrup and simmered gently for about 30 minutes. She stirred them carefully so they wouldn't break apart. The cherries absorbed the syrup and turned glossy and translucent. When they were ready, she lifted them out of the syrup with a slotted spoon and laid them on a wire rack to drain. The cherries dried for a day until the syrup crystallized slightly on the outside. Each cherry was dark red, their natural color, not dyed bright red, and coated with a thin layer of crystallized sugar. Grandma packed them in jars with wax paper between the layers so they wouldn't stick together. The candied cherries tasted intensely sweet with a concentrated cherry flavor. They were soft and chewy with a slight crunch from the sugar coating. The natural cherry flavor came through, not artificial or chemical tasting like store-bought candied cherries. She used them in fruitcakes and Christmas cookies or ate them plain as candy. A batch cost almost nothing to make if you had cherry trees, maybe 20 cents for the sugar in 1953. The cherries kept for months in jars, stored in a cool, dark place. By the 1960s, bright red dyed candied cherries from the store replaced homemade ones. The store-bought cherries were uniform in color and size, but they tasted artificial. The natural dark red color and real cherry flavor of homemade candied cherries disappeared. It was a clear-out-the-pantry candy made with whatever nuts were left over. Nut brittle was the farmhouse candy made with a mix of pecans, walnuts, almonds, or whatever nuts were in the cupboard. Grandma stood at the stove with a heavy pot and poured in 2 cups of sugar, 1 cup of corn syrup, and a 1/4 cup of water. She cooked it over medium heat, stirring occasionally, until it reached hard crack stage. The syrup turned golden and thick. When it was ready, tested by dropping a spoonful into cold water until it formed hard, brittle threads, she stirred in 2 cups of mixed nuts. The nuts had been roughly chopped so they would distribute evenly through the brittle. She added a tablespoon of butter and a teaspoon of baking soda. The mixture foamed up dramatically and turned lighter in color. The baking soda made the brittle porous and easier to bite. She poured the hot mixture quickly onto 2 buttered baking sheets and spread it thin with a spatula. The brittle had to be thin, about a 1/4 inch thick, or it would be too hard to break and eat. She worked fast because the brittle started to set up as soon as it hit the pan. The brittle cooled on the counter for about an hour until it was completely hard. Then she broke it into irregular pieces with her hands. Each piece was golden and translucent with nuts throughout. A batch cost about 60 cents to make in 1952 and filled 2 large tins. Grandma made nut brittle at the end of the holiday season when she had bits of different nuts left over from baking. It was a way to use up odds and ends without wasting anything. The mixed nut flavor made every piece taste slightly different. By the 1960s, people wanted uniform candy with one type of nut, peanut brittle or pecan brittle, not a mix. The clear-out-the-pantry nut brittle disappeared. Nut brittle vanished from farmhouse kitchens. Nobody makes it anymore. It was the rose-water candy often gifted in farmhouse Christmas boxes. Turkish Delight was the soft, gel-like candy made with cornstarch, sugar, and rosewater. Grandma stood at the stove with a heavy pot and mixed 2 cups of sugar with 4 cups of water. She brought it to a boil, stirring until the sugar dissolved. In a separate bowl, she mixed half a cup of cornstarch with a cup of cold water until smooth. She poured the cornstarch mixture into the boiling sugar water, stirring constantly. The mixture thickened immediately and turned translucent. She kept cooking it over low heat, stirring constantly, for about 30 minutes. The mixture had to cook long enough for the cornstarch taste to disappear. When it was ready, she added a tablespoon of rose water, the kind used for baking, not perfume, and stirred it through. The candy smelled floral and sweet. She poured the hot mixture into a buttered 9x9 pan and let it cool completely. The Turkish Delight set up into a firm gel. When it was firm, she turned it out onto a cutting board dusted with powdered sugar. She cut it into small cubes with a buttered knife. Each cube was translucent and jelly-like. She rolled each piece in powdered sugar to coat it completely so the pieces wouldn't stick together. The Turkish Delight was soft and chewy, with a delicate floral flavor. It tasted like roses and sugar, with a gel-like texture that dissolved slowly on the tongue. The powdered sugar coating gave it a sweet outer layer. Grandma packed the Turkish Delight in small boxes lined with wax paper and gave them as Christmas gifts. The candy kept for weeks if stored in a cool, dry place. A batch cost about 40 cents to make in 1951. By the 1960s, rosewater became harder to find in regular stores, and the floral flavor seemed old-fashioned to younger people who had grown up with chocolate and peanut butter. The delicate perfumed taste of Turkish Delight didn't appeal to American palates anymore. The homemade rosewater version disappeared from Christmas gift boxes. Turkish Delight vanished from farmhouse kitchens. Nobody makes it anymore. Cream caramels stirred for 30 minutes straight. Peppermint patties dipped thick fondant in chocolate. Candied cherries simmered whole cherries in sugar syrup. Nut brittle used whatever nuts were left in the pantry. Turkish Delight cooked cornstarch with rose water for an hour. These were the farmhouse candies that took patience and time. Nobody makes them anymore. They were honey-heavy and packed with almonds. Nougat bars were the farmhouse candy made with honey, egg whites, and nuts. Grandma stood at the stove with a heavy pot and poured in 1 cup of honey and 1 cup of sugar. She cooked it over medium heat until it reached hard ball stage, testing it by dropping a spoonful into cold water until it formed a hard ball. While the honey mixture cooked, she beat 2 egg whites in a large bowl until they were stiff and formed peaks. When the honey syrup was ready, she poured it in a thin stream into the egg whites, beating constantly with a hand mixer. The mixture turned white and fluffy and held its shape. She kept beating until it was thick and glossy. Then she stirred in 2 cups of toasted almonds she had toasted in the oven until they were fragrant and golden. The nougat mixture was thick and sticky and held the almonds suspended throughout. She poured it into a buttered 9 by 13 pan lined with parchment paper. She pressed it down firmly with a buttered spatula until it was even and compact. The nougat had to set overnight at room temperature. It couldn't go in the refrigerator, or it would become too hard. The next day, she turned it out onto a cutting board and cut it into bars with a sharp knife. Each bar was white with almonds throughout. The nougat was chewy and sticky with an intense honey flavor. The almonds added crunch and a toasted, nutty flavor. The texture was similar to the nougat in a Three Musketeers bar, but denser and chewier. Each bar stuck to your teeth when you chewed it. The honey flavor was strong and floral. You could taste what flowers the bees had visited. A batch cost about 80 cents to make in 1955 because honey was expensive. Grandma made nougat bars for special occasions and holidays. By the 1970s, corn syrup replaced honey in most candy recipes because it was cheaper and easier to work with. The intense honey flavor disappeared. The homemade nougat bars with real honey and whole almonds vanished from farmhouse kitchens. Nougat bars disappeared. Nobody makes them anymore. It wasn't fancy, but caramel apples on a stick was a lovable farmhouse treat made every fall when the apple trees were heavy with fruit. Grandma picked apples early in the morning. She used tart apples like Granny Smith or wine sap because they balanced the sweet caramel. She washed them and dried them completely, rubbing each apple with a towel until it was bone dry. Any moisture on the apple would make the caramel slide off. She pushed a wooden stick into the stem end of each apple, going in about 2 inches so the stick was secure and wouldn't wobble when you held it. On the stove, she made caramel from scratch. 2 cups of sugar, 1 cup of heavy cream, half a cup of corn syrup, and a stick of butter went into a heavy pot. She cooked it over medium heat, stirring constantly with a wooden spoon until it reached firm ball stage, about 245 degrees on a candy thermometer. The caramel had to be thick enough to coat the apples and not slide off. When the caramel was ready, she took it off the heat and let it cool slightly. If it was too hot, it would be too thin and drip off the apples in puddles. She dipped each apple into the caramel, turning it to coat all sides, and let the excess drip off slowly. Then she set each apple on a buttered baking sheet to cool. The caramel coating was thick, about 1/4 inch, and covered the apple completely, from the stick down to the bottom. The thick, homemade caramel coating on tart farm apples disappeared. Caramel apples on a stick vanished from farmhouse kitchens. Nobody boils sugar and cream on the stove for caramel anymore. The 1/4 inch thick coating is gone. The tart apples, balanced with sweet caramel, disappeared. The fall tradition of making them from scratch is forgotten. It wasn't fancy, but marzipan was a lovable almond paste candy shaped like tiny potatoes and fruits on every farmhouse Christmas table. Grandma started with 2 cups of blanched almonds. Almonds she had blanched herself by dropping them in boiling water for 1 minute and then slipping the brown skins off one by one. She spread the blanched almonds on a baking sheet and let them dry completely overnight. The almonds had to be bone dry, or the marzipan would be too sticky. The next day, she ground the almonds in a meat grinder, running them through twice until they were as fine as flour. The ground almonds smelled sweet and nutty and felt silky between her fingers. The ground almonds went into a bowl with 1 cup of powdered sugar. She stirred them together until they were evenly mixed, then added 1 egg white, just enough to make the mixture hold together like a dough. The marzipan smelled like almonds and sugar, sweet and intense. She kneaded it with her hands for about 5 minutes until it was smooth and pliable like Play-Doh. If it was too dry, she added a few drops of water. If it was too sticky, she added more powdered sugar. Then came the shaping. She rolled small pieces of marzipan into tiny potatoes, each about the size of a walnut, and dusted them with cocoa powder to make them look like real potatoes with brown skin. She shaped miniature apples and painted them with red food coloring mixed with a tiny bit of water. She made little pears, oranges, and bananas. Be each piece carefully shaped and painted, she used a toothpick to add details: a stem hole on the apples, a dimple on the oranges, a brown spot on the bananas. Each piece took several minutes to shape and paint. The shaped marzipan dried on wax paper for a full day until the outside formed a slight crust. The marzipan tasted intensely of almonds with a sweet, smooth texture. It was dense and rich and melted slowly on the tongue. The shaped fruits looked almost real, realistic enough to fool you from a distance. Grandma arranged them on a glass plate and served them at Christmas and special occasions. A batch cost about $1 to make in 1953 because almonds were expensive, even blanched at home. But making marzipan took hours. Blanching the almonds, drying them, grinding them twice, shaping each piece by hand, painting the details with a tiny brush. By the 1960s, people didn't want to spend that much time on candy. Store-bought marzipan shaped like fruits appeared in specialty shops, but it was made in factories, not by hand. The homemade almond paste candy, shaped like tiny potatoes and painted fruits, disappeared from farmhouse kitchens. Marzipan vanished. Nobody grinds almonds twice and shapes them into tiny painted fruits anymore. The miniature potato candies dusted with cocoa are gone. It wasn't fancy, but lemon drops were a lovable farmhouse, hard candy made with sugar, corn syrup, and fresh lemon juice. Grandma stood at the stove with a heavy pot and poured in 2 cups of sugar, half a cup of corn syrup, and half a cup of water. She cooked it over medium heat, stirring occasionally with a wooden spoon, until the mixture reached hard crack stage, about 300 degrees on a candy thermometer. The syrup turned clear and thick, bubbling steadily. When it was ready, tested by dropping a spoonful into a cup of cold water until it formed hard, brittle threads, she took it off the heat and let it cool for 1 minute. Then she stirred in the juice of 2 fresh lemons, squeezing them by hand over a strainer to catch the seeds. A few drops of yellow food coloring went in next, turning the syrup bright sunshine yellow. The mixture smelled intensely lemony, and the kitchen filled with the bright, sharp scent of citrus. She poured the hot syrup onto a buttered marble slab, or, if she didn't have a marble slab, onto a buttered baking sheet. The syrup spread out in a thin, glossy pool. The candy cooled for about 5 minutes until she could handle it without burning her fingers. Then she cut it into small pieces with buttered scissors, working quickly before it hardened completely. Each piece was about the size of a marble. While the candy was still slightly warm and tacky, she rolled each piece in coarse sanding sugar with large crystals that sparkled like tiny diamonds. The sugar stuck to the surface and gave each lemon drop a rough, sparkly coating. The sanding sugar kept the drops from sticking together in the jar. The lemon drops cooled completely and hardened into bright yellow candies. They tasted intensely lemony and sour, with a hard, crunchy texture that dissolved slowly on the tongue. Each drop lasted for several minutes, getting smaller and smaller as you sucked on it. The coarse sugar coating gave them a slight crunch at first, then melted away to reveal the smooth, hard candy underneath. Grandma kept the lemon drops in a glass jar with a tight-fitting lid. They stayed fresh for weeks if stored properly. A batch cost about 30 cents to make in 1952. The fresh lemon juice gave them a bright, natural lemon flavor that artificial lemon flavoring couldn't match. But by the 1960s, lemon-flavored hard candies made with artificial flavoring replaced homemade lemon drops. The artificial flavor was stronger and more consistent, but it tasted chemical and flat, like lemon furniture polish instead of real lemons. The bright, fresh lemon flavor from real lemon juice disappeared. The coarse, sugar-coated lemon drops vanished from farmhouse kitchens. Lemon drops disappeared. Nobody boils sugar and fresh lemon juice on the stove anymore. The sanded coating that kept them from sticking is gone. The hard candies that tasted like real lemons are forgotten. It wasn't fancy, but date nut roll was a lovable farmhouse candy on every Christmas table. Grandma stood at the kitchen counter with a bowl of pitted dates, soft, sticky, and dark as molasses, and ran them through the meat grinder, one handful at a time. The dates came out in a thick, sticky paste that clung to the grinder blades and smelled like deep caramel. She scraped the date paste into a mixing bowl and stirred in half a cup of powdered sugar and a teaspoon of vanilla extract. The date mixture turned glossy and sweet, sticky enough to pull apart in long strings when you lifted the spoon. She laid out a big piece of wax paper on the counter and dusted it heavily with powdered sugar, coating the surface like fresh snow. The date mixture went onto the wax paper, and she used her hands, dusted with more powdered sugar to keep the dates from sticking, to pat and roll it out into a rectangle about a quarter-inch thick. Then came the walnuts. She laid a row of walnut halves down the center of the date rectangle, end to end, making a straight line of walnuts that would run through the heart of the roll. The next part took patience. She lifted one edge of the wax paper and rolled the date mixture over the walnuts, folding it like a blanket and encasing them completely. The roll had to be tight, so the walnuts would stay in the center and not shift to one side. She kept rolling until the date mixture formed a log about 2 inches thick, with the walnuts running through the center like a hidden treasure. Then she rolled the entire log in more powdered sugar, coating it completely so it wouldn't stick. The date nut roll went down to the cellar to cure for 3 days. The cool air made it firm up, turning the sticky paste into a sliceable candy. When it was ready, Grandma sliced it into rounds about half an inch thick. Each slice was perfect, a dark date ring on the outside and walnut halves in the center, like a beautiful cross-section. The date nut roll tasted rich and fruity, with chewy dates and crunchy walnuts in every bite. The powdered sugar coating kept the slices from sticking together and added a sweet dusting on your fingers. The dates were intensely sweet, almost like caramel. The walnuts added texture and a slight bitterness that balanced the sweetness. A batch cost about 60 cents to make in 1954, and Grandma made them for Christmas, wrapping each roll in wax paper to give as gifts. But by the 1960s, people didn't want to wait 3 days for candy to cure. Nougat bars packed honey and almonds into Chewy bars. Caramel apples dipped tart farm apples in thick caramel. Marzipan shaped almond paste into tiny fruits. Lemon drops rolled hard candy in coarse sugar. Date nut roll wrapped dates around walnut halves. These were the farmhouse candies that took days to make. Nobody makes them anymore. They were the chewy, dark cousins of saltwater taffy. Molasses Kisses were the farmhouse candy made with molasses, sugar, and butter pulled until glossy. Grandma stood at the stove with a heavy pot and poured in 1 cup of molasses, 1 cup of sugar, and a tablespoon of butter. She cooked it over medium heat, stirring occasionally until it reached hardball stage. The mixture turned dark and smelled rich and slightly bitter from the molasses. The kitchen filled with the deep, earthy aroma of boiling molasses. When it was ready, tested by dropping a spoonful into cold water until it formed a hard ball, she poured it onto a buttered marble slab or a large buttered baking sheet. The candy spread out thin and steamed on the cool surface. She let it cool for a few minutes until she could handle it without burning her hands. Then she buttered her hands thoroughly and started pulling the candy. She stretched it out as far as her arms could reach and folded it back on itself. The candy was dark brown and sticky at first. It took strength to pull it. The molasses made it thick and resistant. As she pulled it, the color lightened slightly from dark brown to a lighter chocolate brown. The candy developed a satiny sheen. After about 15 minutes of continuous pulling, the candy was glossy and had a firm, chewy texture. Her arms ached from the pulling, but the candy had transformed. She rolled it into a long rope about an inch thick and cut it into small pieces with buttered scissors. Each piece was about the size of a walnut. She wrapped each molasses kiss individually in a square of wax paper, twisting the ends closed so they looked like little candies in their wrappers. The molasses kisses were dark brown and glossy on the outside. They tasted rich and slightly bitter with a deep molasses flavor that filled your mouth. The texture was chewy, firmer than taffy, but softer than hard candy. Each piece stuck to your teeth slightly when you chewed it. The molasses flavor was intense and complex, not just sweet, but with a mineral, earthy undertone that reminded you of sorghum and farm fields. Grandma kept the molasses kisses in a tin lined with wax paper, and they stayed soft for weeks if wrapped properly. A batch cost about 30 cents to make in 1951 and made about 3 dozen pieces. By the 1960s, saltwater taffy with bright fruit flavors replaced molasses kisses. The dark, bitter molasses flavor wasn't as popular as cherry, banana, and vanilla. The chewy molasses candy wrapped in wax paper disappeared from farmhouse kitchens. Molasses kisses vanished. Nobody makes them anymore. They were those bright pink, sugar-crusted peanut discs. Peanut patties were the farmhouse candy made with peanuts and pink sugar syrup. Grandma stood at the stove with a heavy pot and poured in 2 cups of sugar, half a cup of milk, and a tablespoon of butter. She cooked it over medium heat, stirring constantly with a wooden spoon until it reached softball stage. The mixture smelled sweet and creamy. The milk gave it a rich, caramel-like aroma. When it was ready, tested by dropping a spoonful into cold water until it formed a soft ball that flattened when pressed. She took it off the heat and added a few drops of red food coloring. She stirred it through, and the mixture turned bright pink, not a pale pink, but a vibrant, almost neon pink that looked artificial but cheerful. Then she stirred in 2 cups of raw peanuts. The peanuts had to be raw, not roasted, so they would soften slightly in the hot syrup and absorb some of the sugar flavor. She stirred the mixture vigorously with the wooden spoon. As she stirred, the mixture started to thicken and lose its shine. It went from glossy to matte. She had to work quickly now. She dropped spoonfuls onto wax paper spread out on the kitchen counter. Each spoonful spread out into a flat disc about 3 inches across. The patties had to be dropped fast because the candy set up quickly. Within seconds, the mixture would become too thick to drop. Each patty was bright pink and studded with peanuts throughout. The sugar coating crystallized on the outside as it cooled, giving each patty a rough, sugary crust. The patties cooled on the wax paper and hardened into firm discs within minutes. They tasted sweet and peanutty with a grainy sugar texture on the outside. The pink color made them festive and fun. They looked like party candy. The peanuts were slightly soft and chewy from being cooked in the hot syrup. Each patty was thick and substantial, not thin and brittle like peanut brittle. The sugar crust gave them a slight crunch on the outside, but they were soft and chewy inside. Grandma made peanut patties for church bake sales and holiday gatherings. The bright pink color made them stand out on the candy table among all the brown and white candies. A batch cost about 40 cents to make in 1953 and made about 2 dozen patties. By the 1970s, people thought the pink color looked artificial and old-fashioned. Natural colors became trendy, and bright pink seemed garish. Sugar-crusted peanut patties disappeared from farmhouse kitchens and church bake sales. Peanut patties vanished. Nobody makes them anymore. It was the fragile, striped holiday classic that was too hard to ship. Ribbon candy was the farmhouse candy made by pulling colored sugar syrup into thin, decorative ribbons. Grandma stood at the stove with a heavy pot and poured in 2 cups of sugar, half a cup of corn syrup, and half a cup of water. She cooked it over medium heat, stirring occasionally until the sugar dissolved. Then she stopped stirring and let it cook until it reached hard crack stage. The syrup turned clear and thick. When it was ready, tested by dropping a spoonful into cold water until it formed hard, brittle threads, she divided the hot syrup into 3 smaller pots. She worked quickly because the syrup cooled fast. She colored 1 batch bright red with food coloring, 1 green, and left 1 white. The 3 colors would make traditional Christmas ribbon candy. She poured each colored syrup onto a separate buttered marble slab. The candy cooled for a few minutes until she could handle it without burning herself. Then she pulled each color separately with thoroughly buttered hands, stretching it out and folding it back until it was glossy and had a satiny sheen. The pulling incorporated air and made the candy less brittle. When all 3 colors were pulled to the right consistency, glossy and slightly translucent, she rolled each one into a long rope about the thickness of a pencil. She laid the 3 ropes side by side, red, white, and green in that order, and pressed them together gently so they would stick. Then she picked up the 3-colored rope and started forming it into ribbons. She folded the rope back and forth in a zigzag pattern, creating waves and curves like fabric ribbons. The ribbon candy had to be formed while it was still warm enough to bend without cracking. As it cooled, it hardened into delicate, unstriped ribbons that looked almost like glass. Each piece was fragile and translucent with stripes of red, white, and green running through it. The colors didn't bleed together. They stayed distinct and clear. The ribbon candy was purely decorative. It looked too pretty to eat, but when you did eat it, it tasted like peppermint or wintergreen with a hard, crunchy texture. Each piece shattered when you bit into it. Grandma displayed the ribbon candy in a glass bowl at Christmas. The light shining through it made it sparkle. A batch took hours to make and cost about 50 cents in 1955. By the 1960s, ribbon candy became too fragile to ship and too time-consuming to make at home. Factory-made ribbon candy appeared in stores, but it was thicker and less delicate than homemade. The hand-pulled, fragile ribbon candy disappeared from farmhouse kitchens. Ribbon candy vanished. Nobody makes it anymore. It was grown on a string in a jar on the windowsill. Rock candy was the farmhouse candy that grew itself over the course of a week. It was part science experiment, part candy making. Grandma stood at the stove with a pot of water, about 4 cups, and brought it to a rolling boil. She started adding sugar, 1 cup at a time, stirring after each addition until the sugar dissolved completely. She kept adding sugar until no more would dissolve, until she could see sugar crystals sitting at the bottom of the pot, no matter how much she stirred. That meant the solution was supersaturated. It took about 8 cups of sugar to reach that point. She took the pot off the heat and let it cool for a few minutes so it wouldn't crack the glass jars when she poured it in. Then she carefully poured the hot sugar solution into clean glass jars. Mason jars worked perfectly. She filled each jar about 3/4 full. While the solution was still warm, she tied a piece of rough cotton string to a pencil. The string had to be textured, not smooth, so the sugar crystals would have something to cling to. She laid the pencil across the mouth of the jar so the string hung down into the sugar solution, suspended in the middle of the jar without touching the sides or bottom. If the string touched the jar, the crystals would grow on the glass instead of the string. The jars went on the sunny windowsill where they would stay completely undisturbed for a week. She covered them loosely with a paper towel to keep dust out, but allowed air circulation. Over the next few days, magic happened. Sugar crystals started forming on the string. They grew slowly, 1 crystal at a time, building on each other. The longer the string sat in the solution, The larger the crystals grew. After a week, the string was covered with large, sparkling sugar crystals that looked like chunks of glass or diamonds. Grandma carefully lifted the string out of the jar and let it dry on wax paper. The rock candy was clear and translucent with large, geometric crystals. It tasted like pure sugar, sweet and clean with no other flavor. Each crystal was hard and crunchy and dissolved slowly on the tongue. Kids loved rock candy because they could watch it grow. The process was almost magical. Sometimes Grandma colored the sugar solution with food coloring to make pink or blue rock candy. Sometimes she added peppermint extract for flavor. A batch cost about 20 cents to make in 1952, just the cost of sugar, but it took a week of patience. By the 1960s, instant gratification replaced slow processes. Rock candy vanished. Nobody makes it anymore, but it took a week of patience. By the 1960s, instant gratification replaced slow processes. Rock candy vanished. Nobody makes it anymore. They were known as Jordan almonds, but made with a rough sugar crust at home. Sugared almonds were the farmhouse candy made by coating almonds in multiple layers of colored sugar. The process took most of a day. Grandma started with 2 cups of whole almonds, blanched almonds with the brown skins already removed. She spread them on a baking sheet and toasted them in a low oven, about 250 degrees, for 15 minutes until they were fragrant but not browned. The almonds had to be warm when she started coating them, or the sugar wouldn't stick. On the stove, she made a simple syrup, 1 cup of sugar and half a cup of water boiled together until the sugar dissolved completely and the syrup turned clear. She added a few drops of food coloring to tint the syrup. She made batches in different colors, pale pink, pale blue, and white for weddings. The warm almonds went into the hot-colored syrup, and she stirred them gently with a wooden spoon until every almond was coated. Then she lifted them out with a slotted spoon, letting the excess syrup drip off, and spread them back onto the buttered baking sheet in a single layer. The almonds dried for an hour, while the sugar coating hardened into a thin shell around each nut. Then she repeated the entire process, boiling more syrup, coating the almonds again, drying them again. She did this 4 or 5 times, building up layers of sugar coating. Each layer had to dry completely before adding the next one, or the coating would be uneven and lumpy. After the final layer, the almonds were coated with a thick, rough sugar shell. The coating was about 1/8 of an inch thick all the way around and had a bumpy, textured surface, not smooth like factory-made Jordan almonds. Each sugared almond was pastel-colored, pale pink, pale blue or white, and looked delicate and pretty, arranged in a glass bowl. They tasted sweet on the outside with a crunchy almond center. The sugar coating was hard and dissolved slowly as you sucked on it. The almond inside was toasted and nutty and crunched when you bit into it. Grandma served sugared almonds at weddings and christenings. They were a special occasion candy, not an everyday treat. A batch took several hours to make because of the multiple layers of coating and drying time. Each batch cost about 80 cents in 1954 because almonds were expensive. By the 1960s, smooth Jordan almonds made in factories replaced rough homemade ones. The factory almonds had a smooth, glossy coating instead of the rough, bumpy coating. The layered, hand-coated, sugared almonds disappeared from farmhouse kitchens. Sugared almonds vanished. Nobody makes them anymore. Molasses, kisses pulled for 15 minutes until glossy. Peanut patties dropped bright pink sugar with peanuts. Ribbon candy folded 3 colors into zigzag ribbons. Rock candy grew crystals on a string for a week. Sugared almonds, coated almonds in 5 layers of colored sugar. These were the farmhouse candies that took all day or all week. Nobody makes them anymore. It was the luxury version of peanut brittle. Cashew brittle was the farmhouse candy made with expensive cashews instead of cheap peanuts. Cashews cost 3 or 4 times as much as peanuts, so cashew brittle was reserved for special occasions and holiday gifts. Grandma stood at the stove with a heavy pot and poured in 2 cups of sugar, 1 cup of light corn syrup, and a 1/4 cup of water. She cooked it over medium heat, stirring occasionally with a wooden spoon until it reached hard crack stage. The syrup turned golden amber and smelled sweet and caramel-like. When it was ready, tested by dropping a spoonful into cold water until it formed hard, brittle threads that snapped, she stirred in 2 cups of whole cashews. The cashews had to be raw or very lightly roasted so they wouldn't burn in the hot syrup. She stirred the cashews through the syrup for about a minute so they would heat through. Then she added a tablespoon of butter and a teaspoon of baking soda. The moment the baking soda hit the hot syrup, the mixture foamed up dramatically and doubled in volume. The baking soda created tiny air bubbles throughout the brittle that made it more porous and easier to bite through. The foam turned the brittle from dark amber to light golden. She had to work quickly now. She poured the foaming mixture onto 2 large buttered baking sheets and spread it thin with a buttered spatula, as thin as she could get it, about a 1/4 inch thick. The brittle had to be thin or it would be too hard to break and too difficult to eat. The brittle cooled on the counter for about an hour until it was completely hard and cool to the touch. Then she broke it into irregular pieces with her hands, snapping it along its natural fault lines. Each piece was golden and translucent, with whole cashews suspended throughout, like insects in amber. The cashew brittle tasted rich and buttery with a sweet caramel flavor. The cashews added a mild, creamy nut flavor that was more delicate than peanuts. Cashews were naturally sweeter and less assertive than peanuts. The brittle was crunchy and snapped cleanly when you broke it or bit into it. Grandma made cashew brittle for Christmas gifts and special holiday gatherings. She wrapped the pieces in wax paper and packed them in decorated tins. A batch cost about $1.20 to make in 1955, more than twice the cost of peanut brittle. Cashew brittle was a luxury candy that showed you had spent extra money and effort. By the 1970s, mixed nut brittles became popular and single nut brittles seemed plain. The expensive cashew-only brittle disappeared from farmhouse kitchens. Cashew brittle vanished. Nobody makes it anymore. They were infused with real vanilla beans, a rare farm luxury. Vanilla caramels were the farmhouse candy made with heavy cream, sugar, butter, and a whole vanilla bean. Vanilla beans were expensive and hard to find in rural areas in the 1950s. They had to be ordered from catalogs or purchased in specialty stores in the city. When Grandma had a vanilla bean, she saved it for something special. Vanilla caramels were that special occasion. She stood at the stove with a heavy pot and carefully split a vanilla bean down the middle, lengthwise with a sharp knife. She scraped out the thousands of tiny black seeds with the back of the knife and added both the seeds and the scraped pod to the pot. The pod still had flavor in it. Then she poured in 2 cups of sugar, 1 cup of heavy cream, the thick kind from the farm separator, 1 cup of light corn syrup, and 1 stick of butter cut into pieces. She cooked the mixture over medium heat, stirring constantly with a wooden spoon. The mixture had to be stirred the entire time, 30 minutes or more, or it would burn on the bottom and ruin the batch. The kitchen filled with the most incredible sweet floral smell of vanilla. It was stronger and more complex than vanilla extract. As she stirred, the mixture bubbled and thickened. The color darkened from cream to golden brown. After about 30 minutes of constant stirring, the mixture reached firm ball stage. She tested it by dropping a spoonful into cold water. It should form a firm ball that held its shape, but was still slightly pliable. When it was ready, she fished out the vanilla bean pod with a spoon and scraped off any caramel clinging to it. Then she poured the hot caramel into a buttered 9x9 pan. The tiny black vanilla seeds were suspended throughout the golden caramel-like pepper specks. The caramel cooled for several hours or overnight until it was firm enough to cut. When it was set, She turned it out onto a cutting board and cut it into small rectangles with a buttered knife. Each piece had tiny black specks throughout. She wrapped each caramel individually in wax paper squares, twisting the ends closed. The vanilla caramels were soft and chewy with an intense vanilla flavor. They tasted rich and buttery with the floral, complex flavor of real vanilla bean, not the flat, one-dimensional taste of vanilla extract. The tiny black seeds added visual interest and proved real vanilla bean was used. A batch cost about $1 to make in 1956 because vanilla beans were so expensive. By the 1970s, vanilla extract replaced vanilla beans. The caramels infused with real vanilla bean disappeared from farmhouse kitchens. Vanilla caramels vanished. Nobody makes them anymore. They were oven-roasted with egg whites and cinnamon. Sugared pecans were the farmhouse candy made by coating pecans in a cinnamon sugar mixture and baking them low and slow until crispy. Grandma stood at the counter with a large bowl and cracked one egg. She separated the egg white into the bowl and saved the yolk for something else. On halves, pecans from the farm trees that the kids had shelled the week before went into the egg white mixture. She stirred gently with a spoon until every pecan half was coated with the frothy egg white. Then she lifted the pecans out with a slotted spoon, letting the excess egg white drip back into the bowl, and dropped them into the cinnamon sugar mixture. She stirred and tossed the pecans until every piece was coated completely with the spiced sugar. Some pecans clumped together, and she separated them with her fingers. The sugared pecans spread out on a large buttered baking sheet in a single layer. She made sure they weren't touching each other so they wouldn't stick together as they baked. The baking sheet went into a low oven, 250 degrees, and baked for 1 hour. She set a timer and stirred the pecans every 15 minutes with a spatula so they would coat evenly, brown evenly, and not burn. The pecans came out golden brown and crispy with a thick coating of crystallized cinnamon sugar. The sugar had caramelized slightly in the oven. The pecans cooled on the pan, and the sugar coating hardened into a crunchy shell. Each pecan was coated completely and tasted sweet, spicy, and slightly salty. The cinnamon gave them warmth. The egg white made the coating stick and turn crispy in the oven. They were addictive, crunchy, and sweet with a hint of spice. Grandma kept sugared pecans in a tin and served them at Christmas. A batch cost about 70 cents to make in 1954. The pecans stayed crispy for weeks if stored in an airtight container. By the 1970s, our simpler candied nuts replaced the egg white and cinnamon version. Sugared pecans vanished. Nobody makes them anymore. They were the red, glass-hard cinnamon syrup version. Candied apples were the farmhouse candy made with a bright red cinnamon sugar coating that cracked like glass when you bit into it. They were different from caramel apples. These had a hard candy shell, not a soft caramel coating. Grandma stood at the stove with a heavy pot and poured in 2 cups of white sugar, 1 cup of water, and half a cup of small red cinnamon candies. The tiny, hard candies called red hots that burned your tongue with cinnamon heat. She cooked the mixture over medium heat, stirring occasionally until the sugar and candies dissolved completely. The mixture turned bright, on translucent red, an artificial-looking red that was almost neon. The candy syrup had to reach hard crack stage. She tested it by dropping a spoonful into cold water until it formed hard, brittle threads that snapped cleanly. While the syrup cooked, she prepared the apples. She washed them in cool water and dried them completely with a towel. Any moisture on the apple would make the candy coating slide off or turn cloudy. She used tart apples, Granny Smith or wine sap, because their sourness balanced the sweet coating. She pushed a wooden stick into the stem end of each apple, pushing it in about 2 inches so the stick was secure and wouldn't pull out when the apple was dipped. When the syrup was ready, bright red, thick, and reaching 300 degrees on the candy thermometer, she worked quickly. She tilted the pot slightly and dipped each apple into the hot red syrup one at a time, turning it slowly to coat all sides evenly. The syrup had to be very hot, or it would start to set up and wouldn't coat smoothly. She let the excess syrup drip off for a few seconds, turning the apples slowly so the coating would be even, and then set each apple upright on a buttered baking sheet to cool. The coating hardened quickly, within minutes, into a glass-like shell. Each candied apple was bright red and shiny like a Christmas ornament. The coating was about 1/8 of an inch thick and completely covered the apple. When you bit into a candied apple, the coating shattered dramatically and pieces fell off. The cold, tart apple crunched underneath. The coating tasted intensely of cinnamon with a burning heat and overwhelming sweetness. The tart apple balanced it. Grandma made candied apples for Halloween and fall festivals. A batch cost about 60 cents to make in 1953. By the 1970s, the glass-hard coating seemed dangerous. It could crack a tooth or cut your mouth. Candied apples vanished. Nobody makes them anymore. Or hard-boiled ginger sugar drops made for digestion. Ginger candy drops were the farmhouse candy made with fresh ginger root and sugar. People ate them after heavy meals to settle their stomachs or when they felt nauseous. Ginger was considered medicinal in the 1950s. Grandma stood at the counter with a piece of fresh ginger root about 3 inches long and as thick as her thumb. She peeled it carefully with the edge of a spoon, scraping off the thin, papery skin to reveal the pale yellow flesh underneath. Then she grated the peeled ginger fine on the smallest holes of a box grater. The grated ginger was stringy and fibrous and smelled sharp and spicy. Her eyes watered from the strong ginger fumes. The grated ginger went into a heavy pot with 2 cups of white sugar, 1 cup of water, and half a cup of light corn syrup. She cooked the mixture over medium heat, stirring occasionally with a wooden spoon. The ginger infused into the syrup as it cooked, turning it slightly cloudy and golden. The kitchen filled with the sharp, spicy smell of ginger. The mixture had to reach hard crack stage. She tested it by dropping a spoonful into cold water until it formed hard, brittle threads that snapped. When it was ready, she strained the hot syrup through a fine mesh strainer to remove all the grated ginger pieces. She pressed on the ginger pieces with the back of a spoon to extract all the flavor and liquid. The strained ginger-infused syrup was clear and golden. She poured it onto a buttered marble slab or a large buttered baking sheet. The candy cooled for a few minutes until she could handle it without burning her hands. Then she cut it into small pieces with buttered scissors, working quickly before the candy hardened completely. Each piece was about the size of a marble. The ginger drops cooled rapidly and hardened into clear, golden candies. They were translucent and glossy. You could almost see through them if you held them up to the light. The ginger drops tasted intensely spicy and hot from the fresh ginger. The heat built slowly as you sucked on the candy, starting mild and gradually getting hotter. Each drop was hard and dissolved slowly on the tongue, lasting for several minutes. The ginger helped with digestion and settled upset stomachs. The fresh ginger gave the drops a bright, clean, almost floral flavor that was different from dried ginger powder. The drops were spicy but not overwhelming. Grandma kept ginger drops in a jar by the stove and took one when her stomach was upset. A batch cost about 30 cents to make in 1951. By the 1960s, ginger candies made with artificial flavoring replaced homemade ones. The fresh, bright ginger flavor disappeared. Ginger candy drops vanished. Nobody makes them anymore. 60 farmhouse candies that nobody makes anymore. Sorghum candy, boiled down farm syrup until it snapped. Hickory nut candy, cracked wild nuts by hand. Buttermilk fudge, used leftover buttermilk from churning butter. Each one took hours or days to make. Each one used ingredients that came straight from the farm, not from a store. Grandma stood at the stove stirring molasses for an hour. She pulled taffy until her arms ached. She dipped fondant centers in melted chocolate one by one. She wrapped each caramel in wax paper and twisted the ends closed. The candies sat in glass jars on the pantry shelf or in tins lined with wax paper. They were given as Christmas gifts and served at church socials. They were made with fresh ginger root, real vanilla beans, and farm cream so thick you could stand a spoon in it. By the 1970s, everything changed. Corn syrup replaced sorghum and honey. Artificial flavoring replaced fresh ginger and real vanilla beans. And below and tell us which farmhouse candy you remember. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more forgotten recipes. Once these candies are gone, they're gone forever.